the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. St. Paul in his epistles describes the gospel as foolishness to those who are perishing. For the Jews, they wanted someone powerful, a Messiah to come in and wipe out the Roman horde. And for the Greeks, they wanted something ethereal or otherworldly, something spiritual but not physical. And yet Christ came as foolishness to both, a lowly, humble servant, a nobody, a nothingness in terms of the scope of society. And yet we have this continuation of this foolishness that Christ embraced in the holy fools of the Orthodox Church. These are very, very rare saints. In fact, they say that of all of the categories of saints, the holy fools are the most difficult, the hardest path that anyone can embark on. And so it is, I wanted to talk a little bit today about who are these holy fools and how is the gospel today lived out by you and I in such a way that it's foolishness to the world. We'll talk first about Saint Simeon of Emesa. He was in the 6th century. He lived in the desert for 29 years, basically perfecting himself so that he became what the fathers called apatheia. He was completely passionless. He had no desires. He had no wants, and he was completely kind of emotionally and spiritually stable after wrestling with the demons and committing himself to prayer. He went into the city of Emesa, and in that city, he preached the gospel, not like a typical preacher or somebody standing on the corner, but through his foolish acts, he convicted the city of sin, so much so that they said by the time of his repose, there was almost no more sin in the city, meaning major sins that were taking place. So what were some of the things that this holy fool Simeon did? Well, he would fast for all of Great Lent, 40 days without any food. And then right before they had the Easter service, if anybody knows this, you fast for all these days, and then there's a big feast on Easter. He would stand outside and eat sweets that had cream. They were like cream pies in front of everyone, just to provoke people's reaction and judgment. They didn't know that he had not eaten for 40 days, but they started to judge him. And in this way, he was convicting the sins of judgmentalness. He would stand in front of the church with a row of sausages, like sausage links, and he would drape it over himself as if he was a deacon in the church giving an exclamation. And he would stand at the door of the church on Sunday morning with a jar of mustard and the sausage links, eating the sausage links as people walked in. Now, people obviously thought him crazy, but when somebody scowled or jeered at him, he would dip the sausage in the mustard and splatter them in the face with it, showing and provoking and teaching people that they were being judgmental, that they were looking down on him, that this was not the way of Christian life. In fact, he did so many miracles in secret that it became well known that he was a miracle worker. But at the beginning, everyone just thought that he was crazy. He was foolishness. He would hang out with the demon possessed. He would spend time with them, and then he would cast the demons out of them. They would become normal and come back to themselves, and then tell people, Simeon healed me. I was demon possessed. I was basically homeless and living crazy, and now I'm well and healed. And they'd say, not Simeon. Not Simeon, that's the crazy one. He once took off all of his clothing and wrapped it over his head and ran through the women's bathhouse, naked, streaking, in order to provoke people to anger. People even would beat him for his craziness. He did all of this in such a way that no one could put their finger on what he was doing or why he was doing it. But he was doing it in such a way as to hide his holiness because he didn't want any glory. He didn't want any worldly honor. He didn't want anyone to think anything of him. It also reminds me of Saint Gabriel, the fool for Christ of the 20th century, who lived in the country of Georgia. It was from his youth seemingly chosen from God to do miraculous feats. In fact, there was a point in his youth where he was picking up boulders, making the sign of the cross and picking up boulders in order to clean out an old church. And somebody witnessed this and went in later and tried to lift up these rocks, and they couldn't lift them, a grown man. From his youth, he had this intense devotion and love and seemingly sole focus on Christ. In fact, during communism in Georgia, they held a parade, and they were going to unfurl this giant banner of, I believe it was Lenin at the time, and he hid himself in the building. And when they unfurled it, he came out of hiding with a gas container, doused it from the top so everyone could see it, and then lit it on fire, and the whole thing burned down and fell into the street in the middle of this giant parade. He went out there and started stomping on Lenin and saying we should only worship Jesus Christ. And the mob attacked him and beat him, they say, within an inch of his life. He almost died. And then they took him to a psych hospital because they said there's no way anyone in their right mind would subject themselves to this much abuse and ridicule. And so he was actually deemed insane by the state. Later on, when communism has passed, he continued to live out his life of foolishness. I knew some monks who actually traveled to Georgia, I believe it was in the 90s, to go and meet him. And they said they found him living in a chicken coop outside of the monastery. And he was a prophet. He was prophetic. He would talk about the things of the future. He said one day aliens, which are really demons, are going to come to earth in order for quote unquote mankind's salvation. But he said it's all demonic. Watch and see these things come to pass, he said. This was his prophetic word. In fact, one time there was a metropolitan who was like a bishop, and then the patriarch who was the head of all of Georgia. They came and visited him, and he said, what an amazing blessing to be greeted by two patriarchs. See, the bishop would later then become the next patriarch. He prophesied this. He knew people's lives. He knew the future. He knew all these things, but he hid them under an assumed insanity. So no one could put their finger on it. No one could attribute it to him, or he acted a certain way. Sometimes the fools would even act like cripples. Saint Simeon, they said, would sometimes be dragging himself through the city on his butt as if his legs were broken and didn't work. This is an extreme example of what it means to be a fool, but we can see even in our own days, if you are a Christian in the modern era, there's a number of things that you embrace that the world simply does not embrace. Number one, you embrace family, monogamy, and children. The life of the family is such foolishness to this world. The irony being that this world is in such catastrophic decline in terms of population that we won't even have an answer in 30, 40 years. And yet you go somewhere, I don't know, Costco, whatever, and people look at you. Why do you have 5 children? You know, what is going on? Why have such a big family? Why? Because they know that it's an intense suffering or trial, you could say, to have that many children. So what does America say? Oh, just have 2 kids, that's it. Well, that's not sustainable for any society. And so you embrace the life of the family, the children that God has given you. You open up and you sacrifice the marriage to God and say, whatever children you want to give me, your plan is perfect. That is intense faith in the face of opposition of our society. Even families who have, extended families who scowl. Why are you having more kids? Don't you have enough? How are you going to feed them? How are you going to pay for them? How are you going to do this? Are you going to spend enough time with them? And yet the great irony is somebody will have 2 kids and plug them away in public school, barely spend any time with their children, have their children be latchkey, have 2 careers, all these, a mother-father career and all this, and barely devote any family time. And then they look at a family that homeschools and spends tons of time with their children and says, oh, that's weird, that's abnormal. What about even just the idea of monogamy? In our society, this idea has become so out of vogue that there's this men are supposed to have a private fantasy life that doesn't involve their wife. And yet a real man is completely devoted in his whole being to one woman in that devotion. That's what St. Paul says when he says that the priest is the husband of one wife, meaning that every man and woman is like an Adam and Eve in the bond that they share in marriage. They don't need to get remarried. They have a devotion and a connection between the two of them that lasts their whole lifetime. And in some way, not that they're married after their death, but in some way they will know and have this bond in paradise as well. That is seen as foolishness. How can you ever be satisfied? What about waiting to be married and remaining a virgin? They did this study years ago, and after 10 years of marriage, women who got married as virgins ranked the highest in terms of their satisfaction, sexual satisfaction within their marriage. Why is that? Because marriage and the bond of sexual intimacy is so intense that when you give it away like nothing, when it doesn't mean anything, it becomes debased. It becomes just a physical act. It doesn't enjoin the soul and the knitting together of the two persons. And so when two people wait until they're married, they experience that bond at a super intense level. It is an immense blessing for their marriage, but the world degrades that and says, why do you need this? See, brothers and sisters, everything that we do as Christians is going to seem like foolishness to a world that is set on self-love and self-satisfaction and pleasing one's own desires. Whereas the Christian life is set on the love and the devotion and the service to Jesus Christ. He is our God. He rules on the throne of our heart. It is not like society, that society always wants to put the self on the heart and love their self. And when we do that, we become miserable, self-absorbed, narcissistic, unempathetic, ungiving, uncharitable, unkind, and greedy. It melds a person and it warps them and disfigures them. Whereas the person who has embraced Christ, their life is open to love and service to other people. They see the example of Christ sacrificing himself, and so they sacrifice their life for Christ and the people around them. And this brings intense meaningfulness and joy and deep bonded relationships. We experience something tremendous in the Christian life. Tremendous. When you've been raised in a secular home or a secular environment and you live the gospel and it trickles down to your children and you experience in your family, it is immense. The difference in the love, the connection, the devotion, the interpersonal bonds that you form, such that you realize you never experienced any of this in your childhood. This, brothers and sisters, will not just save ourselves, but if we can live in this way, it will bring the salvation of all of society and the turning around of this great country. May God bless you.